Hello and a very warm welcome to everybody. I am Shreya Agrawal and you are watching Deal Street. Today we're going to talk about something extremely interesting. At the heart of every business conversation these days are two names, L&T and Mindtree. It is unprecedented what's happening in the history of Indian M&A. But it's heartening to note that Indian M&A is now making strides. But just last year that we sort of crossed $100 billion in deal making. It is also interesting to note that it is coming up with so much emotion. It's becoming increasingly melodramatic. Now, why do I say this? Of course, I'm referring to the L&T and Mindtree transaction. On the one hand, while L&T is doing all that it takes to woo Mindtree, one of the founders of Mindtree is actually on record saying, comparing L&T to a builder coming with excavators and chainsaws to raise them. Now, this is a very interesting kind of scenario where various questions are unanswered. One doesn't know if L&T would finally be able to sweeten the offer and woo Mindtree. What will be the reaction of Mindtree founders if they will accept the offer? But one can't help really remember the Gordon Gekko famous quotes at this dramatic opening that we are seeing in the Indian M&A mindset. And I have two quotes for two parties. I have one quote for L&T, which says that greed is good. And I have another for Mindtree shareholders to say that it's not about the people, it's about the game. At the heart of the matter really is shareholders' money, which both the parties really have to be mindful of. One has to do something which is extremely and most significant to the shareholders of both the companies. With me are two very interesting people today to decode the entire hostile takeover conversation coming up in a big way in Indian M&A. I have with me Sumit Khanna, who is heading corporate finance and restructuring at Deloitte. With me is Vinayak Burman, who is the managing partner and founded a boutique law firm, Vertices Partners, which specializes in M&A, private equity, and venture capital. These are two people who actually dabble in the world of deal making in their daily lives. Gentlemen, thank you for speaking to me.
Thank you.
And let's sort of really begin with what is the elephant in the room. This entire conversation about hostile M&A, what really have been the changing forces of nature in the Indian M&A scene that we are seeing such names spring up? I would sort of like to begin with you, Sumit, here to sort of decode and perhaps do some context setting for us. Have you seen this happen in the past? Is it really unprecedented as it is coming out to be? And is this really hostile, what we're seeing right now?
So, Shrija, let's do this. First, let's understand what is a hostile takeover. And then I liked what you talked about changing forces of nature. So, what you need to remember is that invariably these changing forces are not visible. You can never see tectonic movements. Okay? What you do see is the result eventually.
Sure.
So, what is hostile firstly? So, there is a designated set of people, whether through board, whether through key executive positions, who are enshrined or entrusted with the responsibility of running a business. Assuming this business is a living being, as lots of people in the past have made an analogy. And then what happens is that if the larger set of stakeholders of this business, and let's not say larger because we will also probably need to consider minority rights
Sure.
over here. When the set of stakeholders end up being at variance in their interests from the management of the business, especially in an M&A situation, that is where it becomes hostile. Okay. Now, the operative word over here is not shareholders, it is stakeholders. Okay, because it is oft confused that a hostile situation happens in listed companies only. Okay.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so that's why I told you that the forces of nature are invariably not visible. Last year I was personally involved in $2 billion plus transactions, which on the face of it you may not even start thinking of as hostile, and which were as hostile a situation as can be, because here the equity value had been completely eroded. The management was still in place, but now the predominant stakeholders who were trying desperately hard to recoup value for themselves were the banks. So, especially at the start of this whole insolvency proceeding,
Sure.
The hostility and by definition, the dichotomy of interests between the incumbent management and the stakeholders, which are the banks, was the highest. and there is the ongoing and ensuing battle between two large, one domestic and one international steelmaker, which is still
Going on. Yeah.
So I wouldn't comment on that because again we are involved. But what I'm saying is, if you look at the three deals I'm mentioning, they jointly are worth over $13 billion in M&A announced over the last 12 months. People don't even recognize them as hostile, and that's where the mistake happens, because clearly there is a huge vested interest of the incumbent management which is conflicting with the stakeholders, and hence the change of control which is being brought in, and that is the story of all M&A in India as of today. So what we see as friendly M&A has actually come down significantly in quantum, and this hostile element has taken over. So the transaction you were talking about happens to be playing out in the stock market and is a lot more visible. The others are not. So I just thought I'll make that point.
Interesting. He just said that the friendliness quotient of M&A perhaps is coming down. That is interesting. Vinayak, what has been your experience in this space?
So I think from my perspective, I have certain points that I agree with on Sumit and certain which I disagree with. Hostile takeovers in India is not something which is very, very non-prevalent. We've seen this right from DCM escorts to, probably ICL, RCL is the only successful hostile takeover story that played out. We saw it even in terms of, the Dalmia Group. We saw it in terms of various other aspects coming across. But I think let's desegregate this into two parts. When you look at hostility, what is hostility? I agree with what Sumit is saying, that the essence is about shareholder or stakeholder value. But the lens with which you look at a company is slightly different in terms of also the health of the company. An example of bankers coming in to look at restructuring is when there is a need or a necessity of that company because of its underperformance, because of it not being able to pay its due, because of it not being able to come across and timely, furnish the relevant aspects of the debt on the books, is where bankers owe it to their stakeholders as a duty to try and take charge and try and see if they can leverage or turn around the story. But typically when you look at private companies, or which you look at more in terms of under the radar because they are not listed or not on the stock exchange, I think private contracts govern a lot of sentiments. Restrictions and transfer restrictions have far more enforceability. And at the end of the day, you have to look at it to say that the promoter or the founder team per se in non-listed space has far more of maybe an emotional attachment to the company, as well as a large say, because investors in those kind of companies which are private are looking at the promoter predominantly to come in and invest. The moment you move into the listed space, I think the stakeholders are much larger. And I completely agree with what you said. It's the shareholder interest that matters, and the larger construct always is that if you're doing something in interest and value of the shareholder, it is also for the good of the company. If you're doing something purely in the interest of the promoters or the founders to hold back, yes, there is a consequence of devalue or value erosion in terms of the company. Again, without taking names, in terms of even the deals that you mentioned, I think the dichotomy here is in context of founder sentiment and the way the founders are looking at it in terms of the company, versus also an acquirer looking at the perfect fitment and trying to see whether that allies and enhances shareholder value at both levels.
Yeah.
So you have to look at both aspects together and then marry the thought. So hostility per se is only when you're trying to enforce certain things in a particular manner, but it's a much larger domain in my mind.
Interesting. I think both of you sort of had a very interesting take on hostility. You spoke about the friendliness quotient coming down, and hostility is apparently prevalent across a lot of M&As right now. Perhaps in this case, it is more visible because of the listed situation. You spoke about the fact that in private companies there's much more sort of emotional attachment, and perhaps it's less visible in those cases, but you have also had experience. Tell me one thing now, this entire conversation about IT space making itself more and more vulnerable to these kind of overtures and offers. We've also seen this in the past. Is there something particular about this sector? And some way it's kind of, very interesting because the technology space is supposed to be thriving on logical thinking. And here, there's so much of sentiment and emotion coming into play. But it's also about the very fact that they are so agile and nimble-footed. The entire sector that's always up for grabs. I want to get the view here.
So let's see, Shrija, why hostile takeovers happen across the globe, and why they were not successful in India. Let's ignore for the time being. But what happens is that globally, the phenomena was that the management was detached from the ownership. The management, to align interests, started getting ownership stakes in the company, but these used to be very small and minuscule stakes. Now, that said and done, what would happen is the management had a life of its own, the company had a life of its own, and there was a possibility that there would be divergence of interests between the management and the company. Okay, so whilst what may be best for the management may not necessarily be best for the being of the company or the value for the stakeholders. Again, there may be a discrepancy in terms of the perception of value here and now and value long term, because shareholders by definition are always going to mark to market.
True.
But the management may argue about how something may not give you best value on stock exchanges now, but would improve value over a period of time. I don't think these are valid arguments, because if you communicate and explain well enough, it should immediately translate to shareholder value. But essentially, there's a divergence in terms of the interests of management and the company, or the management is not able to create the right value, which is the potential of the company, which maybe somebody else could. And when that happens, somebody else sees on the outside that there is a potentially undervalued asset. They can step in, take it, and take it to the next level and arbitrage on that difference between actual and realized potential of the company. Now, that's when a takeover happens. And when the management does not want to let go, but they cannot control the larger shareholding, that's when the takeover becomes hostile, because they are susceptible to people buying shares from public at large.
True.
And getting them out. So that's how takeovers and hostile takeovers have happened forever. Now, what happens in the Indian IT space? It is very interesting that Indian IT space was set up by a large number of professionals who went out, became entrepreneurs, had their startups, those startups grew, and then by definition, since it was like a startup which was growing, they accessed capital from venture, from private, then from public markets, and they got reduced to a very small minority. So they are the management. It is in minority in terms of shareholding. There is a larger body of shareholders, and then there is somebody who sees an arbitrage possible, has other objectives which can pay more than fair value for. Okay, these could be various possibilities. They come in, they woo the large body of shareholders who are underlying, and the management does not want to let go because it's their baby. Emotions, like he said.
But at the heart of the matter really is letting go, right? That is not really happening. Do you think that these founders need to take lessons from the new entrepreneurs like a Sachin Bansal and some of these new age guys who really have been forthcoming in selling a company? Why do you have so much emotional attachment to something which you feel like it's really ultimately, it's an organization which you built and it's listed, right?
So, Shrija, I think I look at it from three perspectives, right? If you look at it, there is a stage of evolution, there is a stage in context of ownership, and then there's a stage in context of fitment. So look at, in terms of, just to take the cue from what Sumit was saying, right? Companies evolve, and they evolve at a stage where there is distinct difference between being a founder or the promoter group controlling to moving to professional management, which means the companies are now at that stage, at that larger level where they need to go across and have professional management. That's where you're looking at situations. If you've gone public, the retail investors come in. The moment you go into that, then there's a construct of emotion. There is a construct where a retail investor may come in as a value investor, or a retail investor can come in to say that, oh, I'm only looking at short-term profit. A promoter and a founder may come across and say, no. That's where the emotion comes in, because a promoter believes, irrespective of the stage of the company is his baby. And irrespective of anything, it's like where the daughter's getting married and the family doesn't want to let go. So the culmination in terms of the thought process is to say that yes, you're right. Do you need to have a semblance and a check to say beyond a point I am looking at it still as maybe one of the original founder shareholders, but I need to now take a step back and look at the larger good of the company, the larger good of the stakeholders, and therefore see what's in the best interest, versus at times to say that no, I still believe I have much to contribute. I still believe I can go across and build the story in a particular manner, and that's a typical promoter sentiment. So I won't say that there is a construct to say that you take a guidance page from the new age entrepreneurs. New age entrepreneurs also have multiple thought processes around it, and they move, and you've seen in the recent past in some of the examples that you gave, all of them moved at a time when beyond a point it was at such a large level of evolution that it was for the larger group. So I think what's important is for the founders to marry into the thought process to say this is for the larger group of the company, and company is a legacy. It needs to go on. As Sumit said, it's an independent living being, and it needs to see multiple decades than just the lifetime of the promoter.
Okay, now let me flip the question.
Let me just give you one point over here. See, again, like we were discussing before you started this, a lot of things are perceptions. So without trying to deconstruct perceptions about individual transactions, there is one fairly public situation that happened, which was housing.com. Okay, so what I'm saying is that even when you are not listed, when there are multiple stakeholders and your equity position becomes minority, okay, then these problems happen. And again, I will mention it again because probably it has not sunk in. If you look at all the restructuring situations today, okay, the stakeholder is removed from the management. There are huge divergences of interest. The amount of hostility on the ground for managing these situations at time has been life-threatening also. So this is an unrecognized hostile situation which you should bear in mind. So what I'm saying is that just because it's unlisted or because there are no shareholders, the hostility doesn't go away. And I think housing.com is fairly well documented on that.
The fact of the matter, really, what I'm sort of gaining from this conversation is that Indian M&A is maturing. It is evolving. We are seeing different shades and colors to it. And there is some acceptance on part of promoters that conversations will not be a happy conversations. There will be unfriendly conversations. You have to put your foot down. Now, from a buyer's perspective, I want to ask and flip this, that wouldn't you sort of make an offer which is so irresistible that the other person can't reject it? Just to sort of quote the Godfather saying that I'll make an offer that he can't refuse. Why not sort of depend on that line of thinking?
It depends, actually. I think I'll take that first. I'll tell you why. From a buyer's perspective, another thought process that you have to bear in mind is that he's answerable to his, or the buyer is answerable to their shareholders as well. So why do these takeovers happen? Again, I'll get back to housing as an example separately, because I think founder behavior versus larger construct of the company aspects are two separate things altogether. But for you to give an offer on paper, and when these kind of transactions happen, it's a matter of fitment. It's a matter of getting that particular entity within your fold, because yes, that's going to add tremendous value to your existing business. It is going to add value not just in terms of your balance sheet, but also in terms of affinity towards similar situation and businesses as scalability. It adds to your scale, it adds to your value. Now, you as a corporate entity are also responsible to your own shareholders to say, just because I want to go across and purchase, I'm not going to put any dollar price to it. With due respect, of course, you will have a premium, you'll have a kicker, you'll have a sweetener. But you have to have a semblance of maturity to say that this is the best value for the asset. This is the maximum premium that can be paid for the asset, and therefore it's treated as a good acquisition. The moment you bring in ego, then there is no essence around it. And smart institutions will not let egos come into the essence of what the price for that value is. So it's very important to understand this thin line of balance between what's fair value versus what's fair value, along with the premium for various other intangibles. Because the intangible elements also matter. Support of the key management, support of the existing team leaders, hopefully support of the existing promoters as well. All of those marry together to culminate into a much larger organization as a result of the takeover. So you have to take those aspects into account as well.
So now we're sort of coming towards the end of this conversation, and just my sort of, in terms of end remarks, I would want to know from both of you that as we see the M&A scene evolve in this country, if you were to give me like top three key trends, as we move forward, in the wake of what we are seeing right now, the hostile construct? What would those really be?
So when we talk about maturing of the M&A scenario, we are actually talking about evolution of the regulations which underlie the behavior. So the maturity is reflected by how we are governed. It is otherwise, in the olden days we were all animals. So there we see that the regulations are preventing certain behaviors which would have been undesirable by people in control of companies, and they are regulating the behavior of predators who are looking to come and prey on these companies. So that is, I think, so a very, very key trend, and that is where the takeover code, the insolvency bankruptcy code, these are all defining behaviors for both people who want to acquire a business and for people who are incumbent in the business. And that is where the maturity of this entire M&A construct is coming in.
I agree. And I think to add on, all these regulations also need to start taking into consideration. That's what's happening. We see this with evolution of several sectors. It's becoming more and more commercial friendly driven. It's becoming business friendly. So earlier regulations or regulators would only look at it from a corporate governance perspective. But I think now a larger semblance is also in terms of how ease of business comes into play. So along with regulatory clarity and a better atmosphere for business to happen, be it in terms of a white knight structure on an insolvency aspect oriented driven M&A, or if it's a plain vanilla M&A that comes in, more than that, we also need to start looking at certain other aspects, which is basically a huge amount of consolidation is happening. What we've seen over the last couple of years is various investments, be it in the form of financial investments, predominantly private equity or venture capital driven. There are horizons of exits that are now panning out. We've seen a great run in terms of the capital markets a couple of years ago, but now a lot of consolidation is happening. A lot of exits in the form of strategic sales are happening, which leads to again a different element of M&A. You're trying to go across and culminate into one large player for that particular sector, and technology is at its boom. So to my mind, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll see a lot more happening in this sector.
So I think the key takeaways from this conversation really have been the hostile takeover deconstruction of the term, how to understand it. Visible in the more sort of L&T and Mindtree case, the friendliness quotient in the transaction is coming down. That's a very significant takeaway. But you said that consolidation is picking up in a major way, and we just sort of scratched the tip of the iceberg where we go from here. Now I want to sort of talk about the fun part of the discussion. If you were to give me the first word that comes to your mind when I say the following, the entire Jet Airways issue, what would that be?
Nosedive.
How would you react to that?
Finally.
Okay. And insolvency bankruptcy code finishing about more than 2.5 years. Your answer?
Sky high.
Wow. He's on a roll today.
This is the big, tremendous amount of appetite and lots of white knight structures.
That's a wrap from us on Deal Street. Till the time we see you next time, goodbye and good luck.